Got a few props to start this off, so I want to illustrate how cheap it is to attack networks. What I've got here is a Cantenna. This costs about $70 on Amazon for the Alpha Wireless N card, along with an N-type connector, and of course a can of Nally chili. So they're 70 bucks. 8 gigabyte USB drive, Walmart, $8. And Backtrack ISO hacking tool, freely available on the internet, 27 cents. So all said, very cheap. Hacking your network, priceless. Okay, of course, that's the joke. So what we're talking about today is targeted attacks, the current state of cybersecurity, how you can defend your data. You might ask how these three things could lead to a successful breach of your network security. And the answer is, of course, pretty simple. Given enough time, persistence, and motivation, anyone can get into any network. If NASA can get hacked, you can get hacked. Okay, so given the wireless access is one of the most popular avenues, many times you can easily get in through a wireless network that has less security and kind of sidestep into the main network. Or you can use it to passively capture data and later decrypt that data for other ways in the network. Now, of course, USB drives need little explaining. You can use a USB drive to insert keyloggers onto a network and other things such as backdoors, viruses, all kinds of stuff. USB drives are a very large problem right now. And of course, Backtrack, free software that ties it all together. You've got the social engineering toolkit, you've got Metasploit, you've got many tools on here that are very much widely available and free to find tutorials on how to use them on the internet. With a little bit of Google skills, you can go pretty far. Now, before we begin and get too far, I want to give you a little bit of background on myself and my company. So my name is Jacob Kelly, and I started out, as many geeks do, basically working on building PCs and inevitably fixing the viruses and malware that family and friends got onto those PCs. I figured, IT would only get bigger and more popular, so I decided, I'll do a career in IT, computer networking. Seemed easy enough. I like Windows. I liked Windows, and before I knew more about security, of course. And so I went for it. Now, along the line with my associate's degree, I started to see that really the brightest future in computers and IT is security. Basically the networks came up so quickly, they weren't secured properly. So we're running into that problem face first. And afterwards, after college, I got my bachelor's in information systems security. I then moved on to 3 years as a network administrator for the state of Alaska, Department of Revenue, getting you guys your PFDs, on time. And then basically bringing me to today, actually, recently, about 6 months ago, I was presented with the opportunity to work for Sequestered Solutions, which is where we are today. Now, Sequestered Solutions has been around for a decade, providing Alaskans with different services such as secure hosting, backups, vulnerability assessments, penetration tests, audits, you name it, we pretty much do it all. Basically the name comes from a couple things. We take your data and your physical equipment and sequester it in our secure data facility, which is the only Homeland Security critical infrastructure in Alaska. Basically, all 911 calls route through our same facility where we store our safe and secured servers. Now, we also have a diverse set of skills with about over 70 years of combined experience in all of our techs, which allows us to come up with custom solutions for many of your needs. We also have a number of employees that have their top secret and Q clearance, so we can work on federal projects as well. One of which spent 20 years working with the National Nuclear Regulatory Commission on their physical security and audits. So with that said, let's get down to business. This is the meat of the presentation here we'll be talking about. First of all, I want to get right down to social engineering because this is probably the most pervasive and kind of evil threat out there. Now, what social engineering is basically the art and science of manipulating a person to get them to do what you want them to do. And that can be a lot of things. In general, what's happening is a hacker or an engineer, quote unquote, will use a person's good nature against them. Okay, so given the following example, let's say, you're going, let's say you work at the GCI store or somewhere downtown, and someone comes in a suit, and they're on their way to an interview. They're saying, you know what? Oh, man, I forgot there's this document I have to print off. Do you think you could do that for me real quick? Well, most people would do a favor for someone that needs help, and no problem. Plug the thumb drive in, you're in. Another example, a thumb drive. You're walking down the hallway or outside in the parking lot, you see a thumb drive. Would you want to plug that in and find out who it belongs to and return it to them? Most people would, and that is exploiting them socially. People will just drop these thumb drives around so you pick it up and your network gets penetrated that way. Now, hackers and pen testers have been doing this for a long time, at various times getting into the White House's phone system, stealing credit card information, other private data like social security numbers, and even back in the days of the Greek army, they used the famous Trojan horse to sneak soldiers into the city of Troy so they could sack the city while everyone was asleep. That was social engineering, tricking them and attacking them when they were weak. And for further information that's really good, I would suggest go on YouTube and look up No Tech Hacking. You can watch a renowned author, social engineer, and hacker discuss social engineering and ways to do it with no technology at all. And social-engineer.org is another excellent resource for this topic, which, of course, I have references in the end of the slideshow, which you can find on sequesteredsolutions.com. Okay, now moving along, attacks on critical infrastructure. What we're seeing is this threat that's been on the radar for quite a while now is actually kind of materializing more or less. The problem we're seeing is critical infrastructure is at risk because more and more people want their systems to be connected so they can get in after hours and fix issues in a critical fashion, respond to issues quickly and get them back online. Well, the problem with that is now that you have access from outside, other people could theoretically get that same access and get into your system through exploits and other holes. Now, basically, Leon Panetta, the defense secretary, has known this for a while, and he's been telling anyone who would listen. This is an issue. The issue is only getting worse because now the most common hacker tool called Metasploit has this SCADA network vulnerability exploits built in. So you can actually use this free tool, which exists on Backtrack, to get your way into SCADA networks and do damage to critical infrastructure. Of course, not you, but evil hackers can. Okay, and for practical examples of what I'm talking about here, Brazil, in the last 4 years, even as recently as 4 years ago, was reminded of the serious nature of this issue when their whole power grid went down for as much as 6 hours. And what they realized is the critical infrastructure vulnerabilities can cost lives. You can really lose some, not only lives, but all kinds of money and other things by having issues with your critical infrastructure. And their blackouts were not necessarily hacker initiated. Brazil came back, they checked it out, and they said, no, that's actually soot on the connectors or whatever. But the fact remains that it was a wake-up call for how serious the issue can be. Anchorage, for a little bit closer to home, we last summer had our traffic signs hacked and political messages were displayed on them to early morning motorists who were lucky enough to find them. That one was obviously less serious, but you could see how it could be used to do more serious damage. And then finally, no talk on critical infrastructure would be complete without Stuxnet and Natanz. What happened here is Stuxnet was a virus or a worm created by the US and Israel to get into Iran's facilities and shut them down, destroy them and do as much damage as possible, which it did beautifully. This thing is basically a feat. It is an engineering work of art. So that was very recent, and you can also look on YouTube for the same, for other presentations just on Stuxnet. It was very, very interesting recent exploit. Okay, moving right along here, another recent issue we've seen is called hacktivism. Basically what this is politically motivated attacks on computer networks, usually federal or those types of systems. What happens is hackers want to get their way into the system to leak data and bring corruption or injustice to light, however you want to call it. And they do this by a few methods. Distributed denial of service, or DDoS attacks, are very common, where they focus million computer botnets on a single, say the FBI or the CIA, and take that offline. Well, that gets in the news, that conveys their message, mission accomplished. So this is what these guys are out there doing. Another recent avenue they have taken, they've gotten more sophisticated. Nowadays, they're not just doing DDoSing and defacing and just little prank type things. They're actually getting into networks, stealing data, putting it onto the internet, and then going back in and destroying the same data just to wreak as much havoc as they can. It's kind of like a bull in a china shop. They're just breaking everything they can possibly break to make as much news as they can. So recently, last year, a study was conducted that found that hacktivists were responsible for 58% of all data stolen in 2011, which is just huge. Now compare that to 100 million records also in 2011 alone was twice as much data as was stolen by financially motivated cyber criminals, which is the traditional people that are out there stealing data. And if you look for anonymous HB Gary, you'll see a very interesting article on exactly what I'm talking about. Now you can't really see it because of this picture's kind of being pushed up to the side here, but on the picture it reads, "We are anonymous because none of us is as cruel as all of us." And that's a good succinct way to explain what's going on. These guys are teaming up, DDoSing networks just to cause havoc, basically. And you may be on the receiving end of a DDoS, or even worse, you may be dismantled entirely, such as HB Gary. Okay, now more recently, cyber warfare has jumped up on the radar as a real threat. I know back in 2 years ago, whatever, a lot of people were saying, yeah, cyber warfare, that's not such a real threat. But what we're seeing now is that it's jumped onto the national stage in a very big fashion. Obama basically came and confirmed that yes, the US and Israel were behind Stuxnet. Now, Stuxnet was just a really interesting worm. What happened is it came out in 2 phases. The first phase was spreading out so it could get to the systems it was trying to get to, which was Iran's nuclear enrichment facilities. It did that by exploiting 4 different zero-day vulnerabilities, which is unheard of. And that would cost a lot of money for regular run-of-the-mill hackers. So it was immediately pretty obvious that this was not a regular attack. Okay, in the second phase, what happened is Stuxnet would identify, yes, this is a certain system I'm looking for, and it would trigger its actual payload, which would spin up centrifuges and slow them down. And the most evil thing about it is it would report back bad data, so the operators would think nothing's wrong. They would see no alerts. So essentially, these centrifuges wound up and got destroyed. People were completely confused in Iran's power plant. They didn't know what was going on. In many cases, they were fired over this because they couldn't figure it out. Eventually, they saw what was going on, but not until a lot of money was lost and they experienced a lot of setbacks. An interesting quote that I found when I was researching this, one of the architects of Stuxnet was quoted as saying, "That was our holy grail. It turns out that there's always an idiot around that doesn't think much about the thumb drive that's in their hand." And this was just one of the guys that authored Stuxnet, because that's what happened. Natanz was a lot like US Air Force. It was air-gapped. There was no network connection directly to it. So how did it get in there? Through a thumb drive. These spies managed to get a thumb drive in there, and all of a sudden Stuxnet was wreaking havoc on nuclear power plant facilities. Now, a smaller, and I don't even necessarily want to give this credence, but it was claimed that Iran came back with basically a keylogger that made its way onto the US Air Force CyberNet or NIPRNet, one of the highly protected networks, which is also air-gapped. And it was able to get onto the actual drones that were flying actively. So that one is still kind of a mystery. Iran wants to claim they did it, but it's hard to kind of believe that, you know. Regardless, someone did it. It made its way onto their network, and that's kind of a scary prospect. Plan X is a new one that I've just recently heard about. Basically what this is DARPA is planning to spend a ton of money on a concerted cyber warfare project in which we basically spend more money militarily to create a cyber army so we can fight in the upcoming cyber wars. It's hard to really talk about because it's such a vague concept and it's kind of ethereal, but it is real. It is really happening. So we're actually spending money now to counteract this threat. So to add some substance to these statistics, I've been quoting all sorts of statistics to you. I've just compiled a few frightening ones. You can look in the very end to find links to all of these statistics I've been quoting, but particularly I found interesting the FBI ranks cyber attacks as the third most dangerous threat to the US, next only to nuclear war and weapons of mass destruction. There are over 10 million cyber attacks daily, which has been a 93% increase since 2011. Mostly, it's speculated this is due to free and easily available toolkits such as Metasploit, Backtrack, and all of the free tutorials that are available online to use these tools. Okay, and finally, Leon Panetta basically said in 2012, cyber attacks could paralyze this nation. So he's been the most vocal about critical infrastructure vulnerabilities that we're facing. So how do we stop it? Okay, this is, obviously there's a huge issue here, so all is lost, let's just give up and go back to, paper and pen. No, there are ways to stop it. So basically, like anything else, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. You want to do the most basic security principles from the start, and you'll prevent most of the really serious attacks from getting through. A lot of attacks are really just drive-bys that just happen to make their way in. So by doing the basic prevention steps, you can prevent about 90% of these threats from really occurring on your network. Fortunately for you and myself, most of the research has already been done by federal and state and local agencies. So you can find all kinds of good information on Google. And as I always like to say, Google is your friend. Don't reinvent the wheel. Just go out and find the information that's already been gathered. Australian government put together 35 strategies to mitigate cyber intrusions. This is a very, very well-respected document, and I like to see it as a starting point and as a checklist to go through in preventing attacks. The top 4 mitigate 90% or more attacks, which are application whitelisting, patching of the operating system, patching of third-party apps like Flash, Java, and Adobe Reader, and finally limiting administrative privileges to only those who need them and only when they need them. Will prevent almost above 90% of the attacks from being carried out on your network. So if you have a new network, sorry, I got ahead of myself there. If you have a new network, I like the NSA Manageable Network Plan. It is a very great document to start with. Or if you just want to retool your current network with security in mind, NSA has a great document there. You can also look at other documents such as Australia's checklist. And once you've fixed most of these main problems that you have on a network, it's important to come back and keep up to date on current attacks. So you can go to sites like the US CERT to see what the most current attacks are and what the mitigations are for those attacks. Not to mention SANS, and this is maybe the more boring side of security, but SANS has excellent policies and procedures as far as resources go for you to come back and lay the foundation of a secure network, which is really what it's all about. Not to mention SANS has the Internet Storm Center, a newsletter, articles, all kinds of good stuff to keep your network secure, and basically to allow you to sleep at night. And finally, the NIST website has what are called the FIPS, or the Federal Information Processing Standards, and those are great documents to find all kinds of resources about how to secure your network and all kinds of good stuff as well. Okay, so risk mitigation, those are your basic strategies. Now, how do you mitigate these risks? You lay the foundation, that's the first starting point. Afterwards, following routine penetration testing, vulnerability assessment, and review is really the most effective way to keep yourself secure once you've done the basic groundwork. Now, with specific areas like social engineering, there are different things you can do. Social engineering really requires training and the basics like policies and procedures and basic prevention and protection such as password policies, procedures, and all that good stuff. Now, critical infrastructure has a more specific mitigation strategy, which is one-way data flow. Essentially, SCADA networks currently allow you to access them, which allows you to modify them. If you allow only one-way data flow, then you can only read the network and you can't go in and change it. So it's a highly effective way to prevent issues with critical infrastructure. And not to mention other things such as keeping an up-to-date disaster recovery plan, keeping backups of your configurations of your devices, and keeping backup devices to not only vet your updates and patches, but to have in case one of the devices dies. Hacktivism, there are some very specific ones. Again, we covered the groundwork. having the basic practices and procedures in place is essential to preventing this stuff. But in hacktivism in particular, they use what's called SQL injection to get in a lot of these networks. So to prevent that, you really need to be doing code review to make sure that your code is secure, and also doing code sanitization or input sanitization to make sure the code coming into your server is not malicious. And DDoSing is another aspect of hacktivism which can be really is up to your ISP to prevent. So a basic network infrastructure in place, planning it out correctly, and educating your users is what you need to do to prevent hacktivism. Finally, cyber warfare, you can see above, basic strategies just like training, policies, procedures go a long ways towards preventing these attacks. And that is basically it. As I said, I've got all kinds of references here for you. If you want to go on the Sequestered Solutions website, I'd be happy to put that up there. There's actually 2 pages of those. So I wasn't just making this stuff up. It's all right there, and you are free to go check it out. If you have any questions, please come over to our booth. I'd be glad to meet you and discuss this topic further. That is it.